hello everyone. It looks like more people than we have expected, so I hope you're here simply because you want to sit for lunch, not because of the lecture. My name is Yu Wei, and I'm currently working at University of Nottingham as an assistant professor. And before last September, I was also involved as a convener for the BERA ECR network. So I think that's one of the reasons why I'm here doing this short talk. And I won't say too much, and definitely not to say things that will affect your appetite. So I will try to be light in my quick talk. So. Talking about mentorship, I want to firstly, next slide, please. And, oh, do we have a click here? Yeah. Oh, great. So I want to first acknowledge that for me, actually, I think there's a need for all institutions to formalize a scheme that is for mentorship, and I realize many universities do not necessarily have that, or they have that, but it doesn't usually work in ways that we expect that to be. So I want to acknowledge the importance of this to start with. And if there isn't such a thing in your university, or you think it doesn't really work, please feel confident to go back to the university and argue for that to happen. I know some of the universities that I'm involved who have been working hard in the past years to develop a more functional mentorship scheme. So that's the first thing to emphasize. And because of that, and acknowledging there's always not a really functional and effective mentorship scheme in the institution. So what I'm going to share, and I think Rachel is going to do the same, is to share something that's less formal, that happens perhaps outside the institutional remit, like what we think from a personal experience that would be effective mentorship. And so that's personal-based. And I see people like Jen is here, who I regard as one of my mentors. So feel free to check with Jen and others in this room about what I have said. So based on what they tell you, it might be what I'm talking today is the opposite to effective mentorship in the end. So let's just a quick acknowledgement to start with. And for me, thinking about mentorship, apart from thinking about an individual who is your mentor, like for PhD students being your supervisors, or for early career researchers in our institutions, we always get allocated a mentor. What I value more as this mentorship kind of thing is group mentorship and peer mentorship that normally, as I say, happens informally in other circumstances outside the institutional remit. So I just want to acknowledge my understanding of mentorship as being more multidimensional and also even fluid. That doesn't really happen within one scheme or in a certain time. And I don't know how you feel. For me, although I do have a mentor in my institution, a lot of times I feel bad that I need to bother that person a lot, only because I need them to help myself. And also we know how academics always have this heavy workload and things. So that, thinking about group peer mentorship makes me feel a little bit better that I can bother a bunch of people rather than relying on one in terms of their time and stuff. So my understanding of mentorship really has this strong emphasis on group mentorship and peer mentorship. And a lot of times those mentorships happens in very informal or social circumstances rather than formally. I wasn't involved in this myself, but I've seen on Twitter, the University of Glasgow, they had this lunchtime walk every now and then with PGRs and staff members in the school. That is the beautiful Kevin Grove Park, just behind the School of Education building. And I've talked to people who have been involved in those kind of little activities, and they all said things like this kind of informal scenarios really helped gaining kind of information. So just like simply chats and things really helped in this kind of informal scenarios rather than the more formal ones. So for me, effective mentorship also happens a lot in those informal conversations. Even with myself, during the pandemic when I was still working at UCL, what I regard as a very important mentorship thing is with my mentor, because we happen to live very close to each other. So every 2 weeks, we worked in Regent's Park together, and because we both like to work long distance, and a lot of mentorship happens in that kind of scenario rather than sitting in an office or in the school campus. So that, I think, is also another important aspect to mention. And also social media, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn. Sometimes feel free, if we're talking about the multidimensional mentorship, a lot of times people on those social media, talking to people and interacting with people also gives you a lot of information and support that you might find helpful. So I would also suggest taking advantage of those social media platforms if possible, which I find helpful. The other thing I think would be important is the emotional aspect in mentorships. Not that you have to express lots about your emotions, but in those kind of conversations, I find it helpful if we share emotions. For example, even with more senior colleagues, I talk about how I struggle with my workload and stuff, and then they will say a lot of things in common, and express your emotions in this process has been really helpful to find the common ground. And then a lot of other conversations will emerge from those when you feel free and feel comfortable to express your emotions. So in lots of my mentorship relations with colleagues and mentors, I find expressing our emotions has been an important part of that. So that's another thing. And citizenship as mentorship, that's another thing I find helpful. This is definitely not an advertisement for the BIRA ECR network. It's just what I find really helpful when I contribute to the community by organizing events and participating in all those different professional organizations or my own institutions' events as an organizer and things. It also helped because you get the chances to talk to different people, to talk to speakers, and when you are in that process, sometimes some informal conversations take place about their careers, about their experiences, and some little tips they might give to you in terms of what they think would be helpful for you. So citizenship as mentorship is also another aspect that I find helpful. And finally, very quickly, what I think would be a way to sustain a mentorship relationship is, for example, for myself, because I think I've been benefiting a lot, so much from all those different people I have met in the past years who helped me, who supported me, who have been a mentor for myself. So I'm consciously and actively trying to be a mentor and to support others in my current role and my current capacity. And I think this is really important in a context, especially if, as I said at the beginning, when the institutional level mentorship schemes may not be so effective, then bearing this in mind, thinking about being able to pay back would really sustain those informal relationships and pass that on. So I just want to end here emphasizing the sustainability of mentorship as to think about us as a whole. So let's briefly, I don't know if I've gone over 10 minutes or less than 10 minutes. Okay, great. Thank you so much, and I will hand over to Rachel. Thanks.
Okay, so hello everybody. My name's Rachel Sanford. I'm a senior lecturer at Loughborough University, and these are my mentoring musings. I was musing things last night and trying to work out what I wanted to talk about mentoring. I do a 2-hour lecture on mentoring for my undergraduates, which I won't give you today because I can't do it in 10 minutes, as much as I can try. I always start by thinking about what do we understand by mentoring. Often we use a word and we assume that there is a meaning attached to it and that we all understand what that is. But when we think of mentoring, what ideas are brought forward? You know, is it that sense of a teacher or somebody who prepares you for life through showing you the skills that you need? Or is it a superhero who perhaps flies in, helps you fix your problems, and then quietly withdraws until you need them again? Is it somebody who helps you work out that mess, and particularly within a kind of academic context? How do you get that messiness in the brain into order? Is that what a mentor would help you do? Do they give you a helping hand? Do they help you grow? Or actually, when we think of mentoring, does it stress us out a little bit? Is mentoring something that we see perhaps as causing a little bit of anxiety? And I would argue, perhaps, you might have other ideas in the room as well, that mentoring is any and all of these things. And it may be more of these things to you than others, or it may be many of these things to you over the course of your experience. So it's fine to think of any of these things and think of other things, because mentoring, I think, isn't easy to define. And this is where I kind of slip slightly into lecture mode. And the reason I have these slides is because my brain is older than Yue's, and it can't keep things in quite as much as his. So I need things to remind me as we go through. But okay, if we think of mentoring as a concept, then I think it is tricky to define. And I have deliberately kept out a lot of the literature from this. But if you read any of the mentoring literature, we often find that there isn't an agreement on a single idea of what mentoring is. And there are lots of different words that are thrown around and discussed in relation to mentoring. Being a counsellor, being an advisor, being a friend, maybe that critical friend, again in an academic context, a sounding board, or as Yue's just said, that emotional support that you might need. All of these different things, I think, can fall into that idea of mentoring. And there is, as well, as I regularly talk to my students about, that blurring of boundaries. And sometimes there is an assumption that these things go together. And they don't always, really. And one of the things that I talk to them about a lot, because it's often in relation to youth sport, youth mentoring, is role models and mentors. You know, a Premier League footballer might be a good role model, but are they a mentor? And can we really conflate those ideas? And there are many schemes now that look at using role models to try and encourage youth development. But is that really a mentor? Does there need to be something more in that relationship to give it that? But I won't ask you to discuss that in groups because we haven't got time. And I did put a question on here that I was asking myself, really, and Yue mentioned it as well, that idea of supervisors as mentors. Is a supervisor a mentor? Should they be a mentor? I've supervised a number of students now, and I would say that for some I do feel that I've mentored them, and for others I feel that I perhaps haven't. I've been more of that academic advisor, because I think there is something fundamentally different about relationships in some contexts that allow you to become that mentor. And I'll try and explain that a little bit as I give you my personal perspective on the next slide. But I think if we look at mentoring again, we need to recognize the shift in mentoring over time. And when I do my lecture, if you want to come along, you're welcome any point. We always start with that idea of what is the history of mentoring, and we go back to that idea of you know, the ancient Greeks and that idea of mentoring coming through those stories. But we have had traditionally much more of an organic and spontaneous idea of mentoring, and as we have shifted forward, we have come to these more structured mentoring programs because there is that sense that that kind of relationship can be good for development. But there is some tension there, and I think there is a sense of formal mentoring programs having a place, but also recognizing that to some extent we need to retain an element of that, you know, spontaneous, serendipitous mentoring. Those relationships that come into our lives at various points and enhance them, even though we weren't looking for them or they weren't planned. But however we look at mentoring, one thing that we do agree with, or the literature agrees with, is that mentor and mentee interaction is the key. So it's all about relationships, really. And that's why my mentoring lecture generally leads into the role of the educator in mentoring. But again, I won't do that one for you today. We haven't really got enough time. So for me personally, I have researched youth mentoring. I did throw a little bit of a kind of reference in there. You're not obliged to read it by any means. But some of the research that I've done around youth mentoring and youth development programs and the use of mentors has led me to look at a lot of the literature around informal education. And if you haven't read any of that, then I would really recommend going to have a look at that. And there's lots of intersections, I think, between my perspective on mentoring and the literature around informal education. I will just say that I have never at any point really been to signed up, official mentor. I haven't been part of a mentoring program as a mentor or a mentee. And that has, I think, been quite a deliberate decision. I've never really felt comfortable being in that official mentor or mentee role. But having said that, I have been mentored, I would say, and I have mentored others. At least as I understand it, I would see that as being something that I've done. But I've not really signed up for it. And that's generally because I'm not one to kind of put myself out there, but I'm quite happy to help people. And ultimately, that's what underpins mentoring for me. So from my perspective, some of the key points that I wanted to try and get across today are that for me, the best mentoring relationships that I've had have been serendipitous. They've been organic. I've come into contact with somebody, I've worked with somebody, I've had somebody as a line manager, and they've fed my journey. They've given me the advice I've needed at particular times, and actually, they've been the person that I've needed at that point. They weren't necessarily put there for that purpose of mentoring, but in the process of interacting and working together, it did grow into that kind of productive relationship, that nurturing relationship. Often those individuals are people that I have a shared understanding with, so it's an area, we have a shared area of working perhaps, but also we perhaps share the same interests, and importantly that same philosophy, maybe an outlook on life, that we tend to come at ideas and concepts from a similar angle, not always sharing the same theoretical framework, but kind of ultimately looking at life perhaps through a shared lens to some extent. And mentoring relationships for me have always been built over time, because I do think, as Yue said, there is that sustainability. And again, the literature will talk to that. If you want effective mentoring, you need to have some form of sustainability. And I do now feel that those relationships built over time with many of the people in this room have been really valuable to me. And the idea of that relationship shifting and changing is something that I think is really important for us to acknowledge and to recognize. I may have started off in that kind of mentoring relationship feeling a little bit of a power balance, but not really that ever being significant. But I would count people that I have been mentored by and people that I have mentored as friends. And I think that is something that's really valuable, that actually those true mentoring relationships that last, I think ultimately become friendships. And they're not the best buddies always kind of friendships, sometimes they are. Sometimes they're people that you might not see year to year, but you still have that connection. But building things over time gives you a foundation that I think allows you to have those conversations that feed people's journeys, that allow you to talk about them. Knowing a little bit about each other is really important. And I know from my point of view, the work that I do, working with young people in education, the way in which we make difference to children's lives, to pupils' lives, is by knowing them and understanding who they are, where they're at, and what they might need. And I think that's true for us as well in any kind of mentoring role. So ultimately, that idea about an ethic of care is something that if I did have to look at what do I see as my mentoring philosophy, if you like, then I think that's what underpins it. I think there are lots of other things that go with it, but that ethic of care is something that I want to try and build, because I think if we have that idea, it builds a sense of belonging. And as Ollie will tell you, and Kiki too, I do like to kind of have that sense of identity coming into everything that I do. So I like that sense of feeling that through mentoring and being mentored, I am becoming and belonging to a community, or I'm facilitating someone else to belong to a particular community. So that's my personal perspective. Got a little bit mushy there, but that's fine. And so some thoughts to reflect on. I had not realised there were any animations. That's good, isn't it? There we go. Have a think about this. 4 things for you, really. They weren't really take-home points, but if I don't number things, my students don't remember them. So firstly, I think mentoring is a personal journey, and I think that is something that is a journey that belongs to you. I would say that you want to think about what you want from a mentoring relationship. Sometimes that comes through that formal structure and wanting to be tied into those formal structured mentoring programs. But sometimes that doesn't suit you. It didn't suit me, and I chose to do it a different way. Because I think if you consider what you want from a mentoring relationship, you're better placed to go and look for that. I don't know where the next animation is going to go, so we'll see. Oh, there we go. Mentoring should not be enforced, and I think that links to the same kind of idea. And my advice here is take opportunities that arise, but don't feel obliged. I know 1 or 2 colleagues who have perhaps signed up to those formal mentoring programs and not necessarily found them very helpful, because the matching of a mentor and a mentee is so significant, and sometimes that doesn't work out when it's done by somebody else. The third point is being willing to engage, because I think mentoring isn't something you can passively engage with. I do think there is a 2-way process. It's a conversation and not a lecture. You don't want to sit down in a mentoring meeting and be talked at. You want to have a conversation, because there might be objectives that your mentor wants to try and help you achieve, but you might also not be in a place to talk about those at some point. You might need to do other things. So you need to be, I think, confident enough in a mentoring relationship to have that conversation and not feel that you're sat there passively. And finally, I think consider what kind of mentor you want to be yourself. I didn't, as I say, sign up to be a mentor. I wasn't really expecting to put myself in that position. But by reflecting on the experiences I had, it has shaped me in the way that I would mentor other people. It has influenced the way in which I engage with my students, with my ECRs, you know, that lots of, and with other academics. I think it feeds into that. So ultimately, if you are being mentored or if you're entering into that process, reflect on the experience and use it to build your own ideas and continue that journey, because we will always have that transition of people through education, if you like, and I think being able to give back is really valuable. Again, I have no idea on time. Are we happy with that? Okay, I'll leave it there.
Right, hi guys. It's just a bit of a question really, or a challenge to kind of some of the informal mentoring that you were speaking about, and it's a great idea. I'm a part-time remote PhD student at Glasgow. I work and live in Liverpool though. So the walking, kind of talking thing that they do at Glasgow is great, but I have no access to that. And before the pandemic, I had no idea about informal mentoring, all the benefits of it. And it was during the pandemic when I got really excited because everything came online, everything was signed up to. And I think I was the only PhD who really enjoyed the experience of the pandemic because it was so productive. I had access to everything I needed. And now, post-pandemic, I'm starting to see little bits of that eroding step by step, and it's now kind of all in person and informal. And that's just my own experience, but I also wonder about people who have disabilities, so they might not be mobile to do walk and talks, or they might have anxieties about the social side of mentoring. And it's just a question, really, of how can we make sure that informal mentoring is also as accessible for lots of people as possible, because I think my own experience as part-time is probably going to be more common with education doctorates and things, and actually there'll be more and more people who need informal mentoring, but in an accessible way. So I just don't know how we make sure that's accessible for everyone.
Great question.
It's a good question. Can you hear me all right? I'm not good with technology. There you go. That was good. So a lot of the students that I've supervised have been part-time students. And interestingly, I was chatting with Ollie earlier that actually those students are the ones that I feel that I've mentored. And other students that perhaps I've been a full-time supervisor for, I haven't, because there is that sense of a relationship built over time. But I think you're right. There is a sense of sometimes those formal programs that we talk about are very based in a particular context with an expectation of engaging in a particular way. And we do need to be a little bit more open, I think, to mentoring being done in different ways. I would, I think it would be helpful to talk to students about different types of mentoring, how they might engage in other conversations. Like Yue said, that idea of joining communities and feeling that sort of slow build, if you like, in terms of mentoring, just belonging and then being able to feel that you're in a place to engage. I think those are conversations to have with supervisors, with institutions, and also just some of it is about building confidence to engage in those kind of what can quite often be personal and emotive conversations. So I think that would be my perspective. Would you add?
For me, I think I will go back to the original point that it is important. I know you said about the formalized program should not be enforced, but I do think the universities have the resources to really enable and support those kind of things. For me, in our institution, we had this new carers champion is to really support colleagues, especially at earlier stages that are having caring responsibilities. And we do see the effect of that when it is coming from an institutional level with those resources. So I think to start with is something for the universities, for institutions to consider offering support as what that first comes to my mind when you talk about all those kind of things. And the other thing is also what I thought just now about the fluidity and this multi-dimension, because there are many venues and try to identify, for example, Rich, you mentioned about role model, whether that's a thing, and I'm aware of many are like part-timers and things, to try to identify those who have shared experiences, who have shared interests, and see what has been done and try to relate in that way. That would also be another quick thought, but I'm sure there are many other challenges that we need long-term conversations and explorations to tackle. But thanks so much for raising this. This is really important.
And another thing, not a sell, as Yue said earlier, but engaging in professional communities like ECR networks, organisations like BIRA, that's where you can build those communities as well for yourself, which I think can be challenging, especially if you are part-time. Question of that, I think your hand was first, maybe. Oh, yeah.
All right, thank you. Thank you both for your presentation. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. I wanted to pick on what Rachel said around the sort of the two-way nature of the relationship and I guess the bi-directionality of this relationship. And I wanted both of you guys to provide some examples on how to do that engagement in a way that it is indeed bi-directional. So I'm thinking of what you said, Rachel, around the fact that the mentee is engaging the mentor to achieve the mentee's objectives, if you will. So that's a purpose for engaging. But then I suppose you could also engage in trying to build a relationship that is not necessarily focused on your aspirations or your objectives. And I'm wondering if you guys can provide examples on how you do that engagement in a way, particularly when you're looking at just a more relationship building type of engagement that you're doing as a mentee, how you do that in a way that is indeed bi-directional in the sense that the mentor is also getting something out of it. That they, picking up on your point, Yue, about not wanting to overburden mentors, but in a way that they're getting something meaningful out of it that they would also like to do. So just some ideas around that.
Yeah, it is a really good question, really important point. I think that, again, I'll bring it back to a personal thing. For me, I'm a bit of a nosy individual. I like to know about people, but I like to feel that if I understand someone, then I can understand a little bit more where they're coming from. In terms of examples, I think if you engaging with different types of contexts is important. I don't think that sitting in an office and having conversations is always helpful. Going to conferences is quite a nice way to get to know people, to have those conversations sometimes over dinner and introduce. So knowing a little bit about things that way, I think that can be quite helpful. I mean, from a mentor's perspective as well, I think those conversations, if a mentee shares something of what they're doing and what they're interested in, and perhaps what other communities they're linking to, or what other, things they've read, that can be really beneficial, because you expand the areas that you know about, you maybe connect in with different things, and that can be really valuable. So, sometimes that sharing of what you're doing can enhance that relationship. But I think also even just thinking about how you schedule a meeting, making sure that it's at a time where someone has time to sit down with you, that can be really helpful as well. Not just rocking up at someone's office, but sometimes you might need to. But I think if I've got time, then I would rather have a half-hour meeting scheduled and take an hour to talk to someone than feel that I really have to throw them out halfway through a conversation. Just a couple of practical things there, but happy to follow up with that as well.
For me, I'm thinking about 2 points. Like one, you mentioned, Rachel, already about shared understanding, and taking time to know each other. So I think that once you start to get to know each other, it develops relationships, and that kind of bi-directional comes somehow naturally as you develop those relationships and as you know people more. Like for me, I've got a great colleague who is also my line manager at Nottingham as a kind of example, because she tells a lot. She's been mentoring me a lot about teaching, leadership, and those kinds of things. But then she identified an area of her own area that needs development, which is research, and then she told me about that, and then I will think about the things that I can do to kind of support her in that direction, based on, like, we know each other, what kind of thing. So that's one thing I've been thinking, is to know each other better. And the other thing is going back to the peer mentorship, because one thing I've seen lots of people as my mentor, if we talk about mentoring, but also I see them as my peers. Even if they are more senior and more experienced than me, I still feel we are all people who can get something, support each other in ways that little things. If you regard mentorship as fluid and multidimensional, then there will be many different aspects that you will find you could offer, like be bi-directional and interactive to each other. So going back to the peer leadership, mentorship then would be what I would emphasize as well. Yeah, mentors as peers.
Thank you both. I'm conscious of time, probably got a few more minutes before we get to the next session. I think we had another question here, third row.
Thank you so much for a really fascinating, brief presentation, but a lot to think about. My question relates to a point, I think, that, Rachel, you made when you talked about how mentor-mentee relationships can be quite fluid and organic in the way that they emerge, and often that it comes out of identifying shared worldviews, shared goals, whatever it might be. And I guess this is a challenging question, but I wonder if that takes us down the realm of unconscious bias, that we may be quite drawn to mentors or to mentees who we do see something of ourselves in. Do you think that is maybe just characteristic of this process, that that's when it can be super productive, or actually is that something we need to challenge as we're developing these relationships? I'm really not sure about that. That's what I'm reflecting on.
No, that is I think it is an important thing. I think there probably is an element that you're drawn to people that you feel will understand you. And there is I think we all look for, I suppose, I certainly look for comfort initially in some of those conversations. And, I've had colleagues who I suppose were probably in a position that should have been a mentor to me, and I just couldn't connect with them. I found perhaps that they looked at the world in a slightly different way. And so I did gravitate towards people who shared similar views. I think, though, that as you grow and you develop and perhaps you join broader communities, you perhaps extend those mentoring relationships that you have. And I think you grow in confidence to challenge sometimes yourself, not as much as challenging other people, to seek out people who might be able to help you develop in an area that you don't feel that you're very strong in. But I don't know whether initially certainly for me, that wouldn't be somewhere that I would start. I would start at a place of comfort and then try and grow myself into those other places. But I think you're right, there is a danger there, and that's perhaps why some of those formal mentoring systems at universities use a more official matching process to try and match you with someone outside of your school, for example. It can work sometimes, but sometimes that can be a real challenge. Yeah.
Okay, I am conscious of time.
Thank you so much.
Not to cut Yue off there, because I'm sure he's got a useful comment to pass. There were other questions in the room, so please do try and find Rachel and Yue around the conference. I'm sure they'll be happy. And thank you for coming along. If you just give them one more big clap.